The coastal town wasn't the kind of place you'd find on postcards meant for tourists. It didn't have gleaming boardwalks or souvenir shops with neon signs flashing beach vibes. Instead, it had weathered docks where fishing boats groaned against their ropes, narrow streets lined with clapboard houses painted in faded blues and yellows, and a quiet rhythm that matched the tides, steady, unpretentious, and honest. Most people who passed through barely noticed it, just a blur of salt air and seagulls between bigger destinations. But for those who lived there, it was home in the truest sense, imperfect, familiar, and full of stories no one else would ever hear. In the heart of this town, tucked between a second-hand bookstore with crooked shelves and a laundromat that always smelled faintly of lavender detergent, stood the Marigold Bistro. It wasn't fancy, not by any stretch. The sign above the door had peeling paint. The wooden floor creaked near the kitchen, and the menu hadn't changed in over a decade. But it had warmth, the kind that came from mismatched mugs, handwritten specials on a chalkboard, and the way the regulars greeted each other like family, even if they'd only shared a booth once or twice. On any given morning, you'd find retired fishermen sipping black coffee, students scribbling in notebooks, and locals swapping news about everything from storm drains to high school soccer games. And then there was her. She arrived before sunrise, often before the street lights had even turned off. Her steps were quiet, her shoulders slightly hunched from years of carrying more than just trays of food. She wore the same uniform every day, a soft cotton blouse, dark slacks, and a faded apron with a small coffee stain near the pocket, but she wore it with a kind of quiet dignity, as if it were armor. She didn't talk much during the early shift. She'd nod to the cook, fill the sugar dispensers, wipe down tables with a cloth that had seen better days, and brew the first pot of coffee with the precision of someone who knew exactly how many scoops made the perfect cup for Mr. Callahan, who always sat in booth 3 and never left a tip, but always left a kind word. Her name wasn't something she offered freely. To most, she was just the waitress or honey or sweetheart, terms tossed around without much thought. But if you asked the old piano tuner who came once a month to check the neglected upright in the corner, he'd tell you her name was Lena. He remembered her because, years ago, when he'd first tuned that piano, she'd been standing nearby, listening with an intensity that surprised him. Most people ignored the instrument. It hadn't been played in public in over a decade, but she'd watched his hands move across the keys like she was memorizing every motion. Lena didn't talk about her past. Not because she was secretive, but because it felt like another life, one that belonged to someone else. 10 years ago, she'd been accepted into one of the most respected music conservatories on the East Coast. She'd practiced for hours every day, fingers dancing over ivory keys in rooms with high ceilings and golden light. Teachers had called her a once-in-a-generation talent. She'd performed in recitals where audiences held their breath during the quietest passages. There were plans, big ones. Competitions, recordings, maybe even a debut at a real concert hall. But then her mother got sick. It started with fatigue, then confusion, then days when she didn't recognize her own daughter. The diagnosis came fast and brutal, early-onset dementia. The conservatory offered a leave of absence, but Lena knew what that meant. Delays that could become permanent. Scholarships didn't wait. Opportunities didn't pause. And her mother needed her now, not someday. So she packed her sheet music, sold her prized Steinway practice piano, and moved back to the only place that felt safe. This small town where everyone knew her family, where neighbors brought soup when someone was ill, where silence wasn't awkward but comforting. She never regretted the choice. Not really, but sometimes in the quiet hours after her shift ended and the streets were empty, she'd walk home with headphones on, listening to recordings of her old performances. She'd close her eyes and remember the way the notes used to rise and fall like breath, how time seemed to stop when she played. Those memories weren't painful. They were tender, like touching a scar that had long since healed but still held the shape of what once was. At the Marigold, she kept her past buried. Not out of shame, but because it felt too fragile to share. What would people think? That she'd wasted her gift? That she was just a waitress now, nothing more? She didn't need their pity or their admiration. She needed to pay the bills, keep her mother in the care home just outside town, and get through each day with her head high and her heart intact. Her days followed a rhythm as steady as a metronome. Up at 4:30 a.m. shower, simple breakfast, usually toast and tea. Walk to work, rain or shine, her boots clicking softly on the wet pavement. Double shift most days, breakfast rush, lunch crowd, then back for dinner service. She learned to read people quickly. The couple on their first date, the man nursing a broken heart over a whiskey neat, the teenager celebrating a birthday with his grandparents. She remembered allergies, favorite seats, how Mr. Ruiz liked his eggs, sunny side up but not too runny. She didn't just serve food, she held space for people's lives, even if only for 20 minutes. Her hands told a different story than her calm demeanor. They were strong, with short nails and faint lines from dishwater and scrubbing, but if you looked closely, you'd see the fingers were unusually long and graceful, made for something more delicate than carrying heavy trays. Sometimes when she wiped down the piano during closing, her fingers would hover over the keys for a second too long. She never pressed them down. Not in front of anyone. But in the privacy of her tiny apartment, late at night when the world was asleep, she'd sit at the second-hand keyboard she'd bought from a garage sale and play softly, so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Just scales at first, then simple pieces. Then on nights when the ache in her chest felt too heavy, she'd play something grand. Beethoven, Debussy, Rachmaninoff, letting the music carry what words never could. She didn't dream of fame anymore. She didn't imagine standing on a stage with spotlights and applause. But she still believed in the power of music, not as performance, but as truth. A single note could say more than 1,000 words. A chord could hold grief, joy, longing all at once, and even if no one ever heard her play again, she knew that part of her hadn't died. It was just waiting. The town didn't know her secret. The regulars saw a hard-working woman who always had a smile, even on her worst days. The new customers assumed she'd always been here, that this was all she'd ever wanted. And maybe in a way they were right. Because Lena had learned something most people never did. That dignity wasn't about where you stood, but how you carried yourself. That worth wasn't measured in stages or salaries, but in kindness, consistency, and the quiet courage to keep going when life didn't turn out the way you planned. She didn't resent her life. She'd made peace with it, but peace wasn't the same as surrender. Deep down beneath the apron and the tired eyes there was still a spark, an ember that hadn't been extinguished, just banked. And sometimes when the wind blew just right off the ocean and the bistro was empty except for the hum of the refrigerator, she'd glance at that old piano in the corner and wonder, what if? Not in a desperate way, not with bitterness, just a soft human wondering, the kind that keeps dreams alive even when they're tucked away in drawers. She didn't know it yet, but that wondering was about to meet its moment. For now, though, there were tables to clear, coffee to refill, and a new pot of soup simmering on the stove. She tied her apron, smoothed her hair, and stepped back into the warm, familiar chaos of the Marigold Bistro, unaware that soon everything would change. Not because she sought it, but because sometimes life has a way of bringing your past back to you, not to haunt you, but to remind you who you really are. Rain had been falling since dawn, not the kind that pours in sheets, but a slow, steady drizzle that turned the streets into mirrors and made the air smell like wet stone and old wood. It was the kind of weather that made people stay inside, wrapped in blankets with mugs of something warm. But at the Marigold Bistro, the door kept opening, letting in gusts of damp wind and the occasional customer shaking water from their coat, like a dog fresh from the sea. Lena was halfway through her lunch shift, refilling waters and clearing plates with the quiet efficiency she'd perfected over years. Her feet ached, but she didn't mind. Aches were familiar. They meant she'd worked, that she'd shown up. That was enough. She'd just delivered a grilled cheese sandwich to a college student hunched over a laptop when the bell above the door chimed again. This time with a different kind of weight. A black sedan, sleek and silent, had pulled up to the curb. It didn't belong, not here. Cars like that belonged in downtown garages or private driveways with security gates. This one idled for a moment before a man stepped out, holding a black umbrella that looked like it had never seen real rain. He wore a tailored overcoat, leather shoes that probably cost more than Lena made in a week, and an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. He didn't say hello when he walked in, didn't nod at the host stand or glance at the menu board. He just strode to the best table by the window, the one with the clearest view of the harbor, and sat down like he owned the place. The damp air clung to his presence, but not in a comforting way. It felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. Lena approached with a smile she'd practiced in the mirror years ago. Not too wide, not too eager, just warm enough to be polite. "Welcome," she said, placing a menu in front of him. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" He looked up, eyes sharp and assessing, like he was pricing her worth in seconds. "Do you have anything imported? Or is it all local swill?" The words landed like a pebble in still water, small but rippling. Lena didn't flinch. She'd dealt with difficult customers before. Tourists who thought small towns meant small service. Businessmen who mistook kindness for weakness. She kept her voice even. "We carry a few European wines. Nothing flashy, but they're honest bottles. Or I can make you a coffee. Our beans are roasted fresh every Monday." He scoffed, barely hiding it. "Coffee, black, and don't take all day." She nodded and walked away, her back straight, her steps steady. But inside something tightened. Not anger, she didn't have the luxury of wasting energy on that, but a quiet alertness. This man wasn't just rude. He carried a kind of arrogance that wasn't born from confidence, but from never having been told no. His name, she'd learned later from the reservation slip the manager had tucked under the register, was Julian Voss. He was in town for a private yacht gathering, some high-end networking event where deals were made over champagne and caviar. He'd come to the Marigold on a dare, someone had joked. See if you can find a decent meal outside your bubble. He'd accepted the challenge like it was a game, not realizing that for the people here, life wasn't a game. It was work. It was care. It was showing up day after day even when no one was watching. When Lena returned with his coffee, he barely glanced at it. "Is this the best you've got?" he asked, stirring it once with a plastic spoon like it was beneath him. "It's the best we make," she replied simply. He smirked. "Guess talent doesn't run in the staff here." The comment wasn't loud, but it cut through the low hum of conversation like a knife. A couple at the next table exchanged glances. The college student paused his typing. Even the cook, usually hidden behind the pass, peeked out with a frown. Lena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't let it show. She'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't about winning arguments. It was about refusing to lose yourself in them. "I'll put your order in," she said, turning away before he could see the flicker in her eyes. She walked to the kitchen, placed his order, grilled salmon, steamed vegetables, no sauce, and leaned against the counter for just a second, closing her eyes. Not to cry, not to rage, just to breathe. She remembered her mother's voice, soft but firm. "Don't let anyone make you feel small. You carry your worth inside you. No one can take that." Back out front, Julian scrolled through his phone, one hand resting on the edge of the piano bench without even noticing it. The old upright sat in the corner like a forgotten relic, its wood scratched, its keys slightly yellowed, its lid propped open with a rolled-up napkin. Most customers didn't even register it was there, but Julian, with his eye for detail and his habit of judging everything around him, had noticed it the moment he walked in, and now, an idea was forming. It started as a flicker of amusement, then grew into something sharper, something cruel. He'd seen the way the waitress moved, the way she held herself. Too composed, too calm. It annoyed him. People like her were supposed to be grateful for his presence, for his money, for the fact that he'd even deigned to sit in this quaint little hole. But she hadn't flinched, hadn't groveled, hadn't given him the reaction he expected, so he decided to test her. When Lena returned with his plate, he looked up with a slow, deliberate smile. "You know, I've always wondered, do any of you actually know how to play that thing?" He jerked his chin toward the piano. She set the plate down carefully. "I couldn't say." "Couldn't say?" He raised an eyebrow. "Or won't say?" She met his gaze just for a second. "Some things aren't meant for show." He laughed, a short, dry sound. "Oh, I like that, mysterious, but let's be real, this isn't Vienna. It's a diner with a piano no one uses. Probably out of tune. Probably hasn't been touched in years." He took a bite of salmon, chewed slowly, then set his fork down with a clink. "Tell you what, I'll donate $500 to this place right now, cash, if someone can sit down and play something worth listening to. Not heart and soul, not a nursery rhyme. Something real." The room went still. The manager, a kind man named Eli who'd run the Marigold for 20 years, stepped forward nervously. "Sir, that's very generous, but we don't—" "No," Julian interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let her decide. He looked directly at Lena. Go on. You're the one who serves, cleans, and pretends to have dignity. Prove it. It wasn't a request. It was a trap. A public challenge wrapped in charity designed to humiliate. If she refused, she'd look cowardly. If she played badly, she'd confirm his belief that people like her had no place near anything refined. Either way, he won. Lena stood there, tray in hand, heart pounding, not from fear but from something deeper. A memory. The feel of cool ivory under her fingertips. The silence before the first note. The way music could turn shame into strength. She didn't speak. She just untied her apron, folded it neatly and laid it on the empty booth beside her. Then, without looking at Julian, without glancing at the watching faces, she walked toward the piano. Her steps were calm, but inside, a storm was rising. Not of anger, but of release. For years, she'd kept her music locked away, afraid it would remind her of what she'd lost. But now, standing in front of that old, neglected instrument, she realized something. Music wasn't about the stage. It wasn't about approval. It was about truth. And if she played even once, even here, it wouldn't be for him. It would be for herself. She sat down. The bench creaked under her weight. Dust floated in the dim light. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, testing their resistance. They were stiff, uneven, but alive. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and then she began. But that moment, the first note, the stunned silence, the shift in the air, would come later. For now, in this rain-soaked afternoon, as Julian leaned back with a smirk, convinced he'd already won, he had no idea that the woman he'd tried to belittle was about to do something he'd never forget. He thought he was watching a performance, but what he was really witnessing was a homecoming. The first note didn't come right away. There was a pause, just a breath, just a heartbeat, but in that silence, something shifted. The air in the bistro grew thick, like the room itself was leaning in. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A spoon clinked against a coffee cup somewhere in the back. And then her fingers touched the keys. It wasn't a grand opening. Not at first. Just a single low note, deep and resonant, held long enough to settle into the bones of everyone listening. Then another, slightly higher, weaving into the first like a question. Then a third. Slowly, gently, she began to build something out of nothing, her hands moving with a quiet certainty that surprised even her. She hadn't planned what to play. There was no set piece in her mind, no rehearsed performance. Instead, she let her fingers remember what her heart had never forgotten. What came next wasn't on any sheet music. It was an improvisation, raw, honest, and achingly human. The melody started simple, almost childlike, but soon deepened into something richer, more complex. It carried the loneliness of late-night walks home, the weight of unpaid bills, the quiet strength of showing up when no one's watching. But it also held joy, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of her mother humming old lullabies before the illness took her voice, the way sunlight hit the harbor on clear days. People stopped eating. A man with a half-eaten sandwich froze mid-bite. The college student slowly closed his laptop. Even the cook, usually buried in the kitchen, stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes wide. No one spoke. No one moved. They just listened, as if afraid that even a breath might break the spell. And then, as if summoned by the emotion in the room, she transitioned, smoothly, powerfully, into something everyone recognized, even if they didn't know the name. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. It was a piece she'd once played at a conservatory showcase, back when her future seemed as bright and certain as a summer sky. She hadn't touched it in years, not since the day she packed her scores into cardboard boxes and left the city behind. But her hands remembered. Every note, every dynamic shift, every surge of passion, it all came rushing back like a river breaking through a dam. Her playing wasn't perfect. The piano was old, slightly out of tune, and missing the fullness of a concert grand. But what it lacked in polish, it made up for in soul. She didn't just play the notes, she lived them. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes stayed closed. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, as if the music were pulling her forward, carrying her away from the apron, the coffee stains, the tired feet, and back to a place where she was more than a waitress, where she was whole. At the table by the window, Julian sat frozen. His smirk had vanished. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. He'd expected a stumble, a fumble, Maybe a few clumsy chords followed by embarrassed laughter. Instead, he was hearing something he couldn't explain, something that bypassed logic and went straight to the gut. He'd spent his life measuring worth in numbers, bank balances, stock prices, square footage. But this was a different kind of value, one he couldn't quantify, couldn't control, couldn't buy. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable not because the music was bad, but because it was too good. Too real. It made him feel small, not in the way he'd tried to make her feel, but in the way truth makes liars feel when the lights come on. The prelude built to its climax, those thunderous, rolling chords that crash like waves against a cliff, and for a moment the entire bistro seemed to hold its breath. Then just as suddenly it softened. The final notes faded into silence, lingering in the air like smoke after a candle's been blown out. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. Then from the back booth, an elderly woman, someone who came in every Thursday for soup and never said much, clapped once. Then again, and then the whole room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was real, raw. People stood up. Someone whistled. The college student wiped his eyes without shame. Even the cook gave a slow, solemn nod, as if he'd just witnessed something sacred. Lena opened her eyes. She hadn't realized she was crying until she felt the warmth on her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, stood up and stepped back from the piano, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. She hadn't meant to do that, hadn't meant to reveal so much. But it was too late. The secret was out. Julian didn't clap. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Not angry, not impressed, just stunned, like he'd walked into a room expecting a joke and found a prayer instead. Someone pulled out a phone, not to check a message, but to record. The video was shaky at first, zooming in on her hands, then her face, then the stunned crowd. Within minutes, it was posted online with a caption that read, "Waitress destroys arrogant customer with piano skills. You won't believe your ears." By the time Lena returned to the kitchen to wash her hands, her fingers still trembling slightly, the clip had already been shared dozens of times. A local news intern saw it during her lunch break and sent it to her editor. A retired music professor, scrolling through his feed while drinking tea, paused his cup midair and watched it 3 times in a row. A high school music teacher showed it to her class the next day, saying, "This is what passion looks like." But in that moment, none of that mattered to Lena. All she felt was the quiet hum of relief, and something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the loud, boastful kind, but the deep, steady kind that comes from knowing you stayed true to yourself, even when no one was watching. She walked back out to the dining room, expecting awkwardness, maybe even pity. But instead, people smiled at her like they'd just met her for the first time. The elderly woman squeezed her hand. "You've been holding out on us," she said with a wink. The college student asked, "Do you teach lessons?" A regular, who usually just grunted thanks, now said, "That was beautiful. Thank you." Even Eli, the manager, stood by the register with tears in his eyes. "Lena," he said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell us?" She shrugged, her voice soft. "It didn't feel like it belonged here." "But it does," he said. "It always did." Julian finally stood up. He didn't say anything at first. Just gathered his coat, folded his napkin, and placed a crisp $100 bill on the table, far more than his meal cost. Then, as he passed her on his way to the door, he paused. For a second, it looked like he might say something, apologize, congratulate her. But he didn't. He just nodded once and walked out into the rain. The bell above the door chimed behind him, and the room exhaled. Lena didn't know it yet, but that moment, the music, the silence, the standing ovation had cracked something open. Not just in the bistro, but in her life. Doors she'd thought were sealed shut began to creak open. Opportunities she'd buried resurfaced. And the world, which had seemed so small and fixed just hours before, suddenly felt wide again. Later that night, after closing, she sat alone at the piano. The rain had stopped. Moonlight spilled through the window, painting silver streaks across the keys. She played again. Not for an audience, not for validation, but because she needed to hear it herself. To remind herself that the music hadn't left. It had just been waiting. And somewhere miles away, Julian sat in his hotel room staring at his phone, watching the video over and over, unable to explain why it haunted him. He'd come to the town to prove how far above it he was. Instead, he'd been reminded of how far he'd fallen. From grace, from humility, from the simple truth that talent isn't owned by the wealthy or the famous. It lives in quiet places, in tired hands, in hearts that keep beating even when the world tries to silence them. Back at the Marigold, the piano lid stayed open, and for the first time in over a decade, it didn't look forgotten. It looked ready. The morning after the piano performance, the town woke up to something it hadn't felt in a long time. Collective wonder. It started with a text from the college student to his roommate. "Dude, you won't believe what happened at the Marigold last night." Then a post on the local community page. "If you missed it, someone filmed the most incredible thing." By noon, the video had thousands of views. By evening, it had tens of thousands. Strangers from 3 states away were sharing it with captions like, "Proof that magic still exists," and "Never judge a book by its cover." But in the middle of all this sudden attention, Lena was doing what she always did, wiping down tables, brewing coffee, checking on the soup pot. Only now, every time the door opened, people looked at her differently. Not with pity or indifference, but with a kind of quiet awe. Some came just to see her. Others brought sheet music, hoping she'd play. A few even left handwritten notes on napkins. "Thank you for reminding me that beauty hides in plain sight." She didn't know how to respond. She'd spent so long keeping her past hidden that being seen felt almost dangerous, like stepping into sunlight after years in the shade. Her instincts told her to retreat, to tie her apron tighter, keep her head down, pretend none of it had happened. But something inside her resisted. Not pride exactly, more like a quiet refusal to go back into the shadows. That afternoon, while restocking sugar packets, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She almost ignored it. She rarely got calls during work, but the name on the screen made her freeze. It was her old conservatory professor, the one who'd once told her she had the hands of a poet and the soul of a storm. She hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade. Her fingers trembled as she answered. "Hello?" "Lena," came the voice, warm and familiar, like a song she hadn't heard in years. "I saw the video." She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "I always knew you'd find your way back," he continued gently. "Your seat in the advanced ensemble? It's still unofficially yours. If you ever want it." She swallowed hard. I don't know if I'm ready for that world again." "You don't have to be," he said. "Music isn't a place. It's a practice. And you've never stopped practicing, have you?" She thought of her tiny apartment, the secondhand keyboard, the late nights when no one was listening. "No," she admitted. "I guess I haven't." They talked for nearly 20 minutes about technique, about composition, about how life sometimes takes you off the path but never erases your footsteps. When she hung up, her eyes were wet again, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was from relief, the kind that comes when someone sees you not as you are now, but as you've always been underneath. Later that week, a retired concert pianist from the next town over walked into the Marigold. He was in his late 70s with silver hair and hands that looked like they'd played every major work ever written. He ordered tea, sat quietly in the corner, and waited until the lunch rush ended. Then he approached Lena as she was refilling the creamer. "I heard you play Rachmaninoff," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Not many people understand the grief in that piece. But you didn't just play it. You mourned through it." She didn't know what to say. "I didn't mean to make it sad." "It wasn't sad," he corrected gently. "It was honest. And honesty is rare." He reached into his coat and handed her a card. "I teach a few students. Not for fame. Not for competitions. Just for love of the craft. If you ever want guidance, real guidance, I'd be honored." She took the card. It was simple, cream-colored, with just a name and a phone number. No titles, no accolades, just a person offering a hand. That same week, the local newspaper ran a front-page story. "Hidden talent shines at local bistro." A radio station interviewed her during their morning show. A non-profit that supported arts education reached out, asking if she'd consider leading a workshop for kids who couldn't afford lessons. For the first time in years, her phone didn't just ring with bills or doctor's appointments, it rang with possibility. But amid all the noise, the invitations, the sudden spotlight, Lena found herself sitting alone one evening on the back steps of the bistro, watching the sunset paint the harbor in gold and rose. She wasn't thinking about conservatories or master classes or viral fame. She was thinking about her mother, who used to hum lullabies while folding laundry. Her mother, who sold her own wedding ring to pay for Lena's first piano lessons. Her mother, who whispered, "Play for joy, not for praise," the night before her memory began to fade. Lena realized then that she'd been carrying a quiet guilt all these years, not for leaving music, but for thinking she'd abandoned it. But she hadn't. She'd carried it inside her like a seed waiting for the right season to bloom. And maybe that season wasn't the grand concert hall she'd once dreamed of. Maybe it was here, in this worn-down bistro in a town that smelled of salt and fish, where people showed up not for spectacle, but for connection. She didn't rush to say yes to the conservatory. She didn't immediately call the retired pianist. Instead, she asked Eli if she could play once a week at the bistro, just for fun, just for the regulars. No announcements. No pressure. Just music, shared like a meal. He agreed without hesitation. "The piano's been waiting for you," he said. Maybe we all have. The first official music night happened the following Friday. Word spread quietly, no flyers, no social media blitz. Just word of mouth. By 7 p.m., every table was full. Not with tourists or gawkers, but with neighbors. The retired fisherman brought his granddaughter. The laundromat owner sat with his wife. Even the bookstore clerk, who rarely left his shelves, came in and ordered a slice of pie just to listen. Lena played for an hour. Not just classical pieces, but folk tunes, jazz standards, even a few original compositions she'd scribbled in notebooks over the years. She played with her eyes open this time, meeting the gaze of people she'd served for years but never truly seen. And they saw her, not as a waitress, not as a prodigy, but as a person who'd carried a beautiful secret through hard times and finally let it breathe. Afterward, a little girl, no older than 8, approached her shyly, clutching a notebook. "Can you teach me?" she asked. "My mom says we can't afford lessons, but I really love the piano." Lena knelt down so they were eye to eye. "How about this?" she said. "You come here every Saturday morning before we open. We'll use this piano, and you bring your curiosity. That's all I need." The girl's face lit up like a sunrise. That night, as Lena walked home under a sky full of stars, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not because everything had changed. Her apartment was still small, her bank account still thin, her mother still in the care home, but because she no longer felt split in two. The musician and the waitress weren't separate anymore. They were the same woman, whole and real. And then, 3 days later, a plain white envelope arrived at the bistro with no return address. Inside was a check for $5,000, made out to the Marigold Bistro, and a single line of handwriting. For the piano. And for her. Eli showed it to Lena, his eyebrows raised. Any idea who sent this? She thought of the black sedan. The smirk. The silence after the final note. She didn't say anything. She just folded the note carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. Whoever it was, they'd finally understood. Music wasn't a performance to be judged. It was a gift to be received. And sometimes the person who needed to receive it most was the one who'd tried to shut it down. Lena didn't know what came next. Maybe she'd teach. Maybe she'd compose. Maybe she'd play in bigger rooms someday. But for now, she was exactly where she needed to be, surrounded by people who saw her, not for what she could do, but for who she was. And that, she realized, was the rarest kind of applause. Months passed, and the town settled into a new rhythm. One that still smelled of coffee and sea salt, but now carried the soft echo of piano keys in the evening air. The Marigold Bistro didn't become a concert hall. It didn't need to, but something had shifted in its bones. The old upright piano, once a dusty relic in the corner, now stood polished and proud, its lid always open like an invitation. Every Friday night, without fanfare or tickets, Lena played. Not as a spectacle, not as a comeback, but as a quiet offering. A reminder that beauty doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it walks in wearing an apron and tired shoes. People came not for the fame or the viral moment, but because it felt like coming home. The fisherman brought his harmonica and joined in on a folk tune. The laundromat owner's wife, who'd once sung in a church choir, hummed along softly. Even the college student, now graduated and working at the local marine lab, brought his guitar one night and played a song he'd written about tides and second chances. Music, it turned out, wasn't just Lena's gift. It was a thread that stitched the whole town together, one note at a time. Lena never returned to the conservatory. She thought about it, of course. The offer still stood, warm and open like a door left ajar. But the more she played in this small space, the more she realized that her music didn't need marble floors or velvet seats to matter. It needed listeners with open hearts. It needed truth, not perfection. And here, in this unassuming bistro where the floor still creaked and the coffee was always hot, she found something she hadn't known she was missing: belonging. She began composing her own pieces, short, tender melodies that blended the rolling rhythm of ocean waves with the quiet ache of memory. One she called Morning Light on Cedar Street, named after the road where she'd walked home for years. Headphones on, dreaming in silence. Another, Hands That Hold, was for her mother. For all the ways love shows up not in grand gestures, but in small, steady acts: folding laundry, stirring soup, holding a hand when words fail. She didn't publish them, didn't upload them to streaming platforms or chase recognition. She played them live in the moment and let them drift into the air like smoke from a candle. There, then gone, but felt long after. Meanwhile, the ripple from that rainy afternoon kept spreading. The local school started a music fund, collecting donations to buy instruments for kids who couldn't afford them. Lena volunteered once a week, teaching basics on a donated keyboard in the community center. She didn't call it lessons, she called it exploring sound. And the children, unburdened by expectations, played with a joy that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. One Saturday morning, the little girl who'd first asked for lessons played her first full song, a simple rendition of Fur Elise, fingers stumbling but heart unwavering. When she finished, the room of parents and siblings erupted in cheers. Lena didn't clap the loudest, but she smiled the widest, because she saw herself in that girl, not the prodigy, not the performer, but the child who simply loved the way notes could make silence feel full. As for the man in the black coat, Julian, he never came back to the Marigold. No one expected him to. But a few weeks after the anonymous donation arrived, a second envelope showed up, this time addressed to Lena. Inside was a handwritten note on thick, cream-colored paper. No signature. Just 3 lines. I thought music was something you owned. You showed me it's something you give. Thank you for giving it anyway. She read it once, then folded it and placed it in the same drawer where she kept her mother's old lullaby lyrics and her first piano recital program. She didn't show it to anyone. She didn't need to. Some apologies don't need words to be accepted. They just need space to land. Life didn't magically become easy. Her mother's condition didn't improve. The bills still came. Some days her hands still ached from washing dishes, and some nights the weight of all she'd carried alone still pressed down on her chest. But now she had a release valve, a place to pour it all out, not to fix it, just to honor it, and that made all the difference. One evening, as autumn turned the trees gold and the air crisp, Eli approached her during a lull in service. "I've been thinking," he said, stirring his tea. "What if we made this official? A weekly music night, maybe even charge a small cover, just enough to keep the piano tuned and help with the kids' program." Lena hesitated. "I don't want it to feel like a show." "It won't," he promised. "It'll feel like what it is, a gathering. People paying not for entertainment, but for connection." She agreed on one condition: no spotlight. No stage, just the piano, the tables, and whoever wanted to listen. The first official Marigold music evening drew a crowd larger than expected. Not tourists, but locals, friends, even a few folks from neighboring towns who'd heard about the waitress who plays like an angel. Lena played for an hour, mixing classical pieces with her own compositions. At the end, instead of applause, the room fell into a deep, respectful silence, the kind that says, "We heard you. We see you." Afterward, as she wiped down the piano, an older woman approached. She'd been coming to the Marigold for 20 years, always ordering the same pot of chamomile tea, always sitting alone. "My husband used to play," she said quietly. "He passed 5 years ago. I haven't listened to piano since." She paused, eyes glistening. "Tonight, it didn't hurt. It healed." Lena reached out and gently squeezed her hand. No words needed. That night, walking home under a sky dusted with stars, Lena stopped halfway and just stood there, breathing in the cool air. She thought about all the years she'd spent believing she'd lost something precious. But now she understood she hadn't lost it. She'd protected it, carried it through storms, through silence, through sacrifice. And when the time was right, she'd let it breathe again. Not for an audience, not for validation, but because it was part of her, as natural as breath. She never became famous. Never played Carnegie Hall. Never signed a record deal. And that was okay, because fame wasn't the point. The point was showing up fully, honestly, even when no one's watching. The point was using your gift not to rise above others, but to lift them with you. Years later, when the little girl she'd taught grew up and played at her high school graduation, Lena sat in the third row clapping with tears in her eyes. And when the community center unveiled a small scholarship in her name, the Marigold Music Grant, for young artists with talent but no means, she didn't give a speech. She just played a short piece she'd written for the occasion, simple and sweet like a lullaby for dreams just beginning. The piano at the Marigold is still there, still played every Friday, sometimes by Lena, sometimes by students, sometimes by strangers who walk in, hear the music, and feel brave enough to sit down and try. And on quiet nights, when the last customer has left and the dishes are done, Lena still sits at the keys, not for anyone else, just for herself. Her fingers move slowly, lovingly over the worn ivory. She plays no grand symphony, no thunderous finale, just a few soft notes, rising and falling like breath, like tides, like a heart finally at peace. Because in the end, it was never about stunning an audience or silencing a critic. It was about remembering who she was and having the courage to be that person exactly as she was, in a world that often forgets how powerful quiet grace can be. And in that small coastal town, where the docks still groan and the seagulls still cry, music didn't just return. It bloomed, tender, resilient, and real, just like the woman who carried it home.